Hi, everyone. This is Terry Arvisu Gonzalez, and you're listening or reading the Tag Collab. This is a weekly podcast and an article that examines things about leadership and learning, communications, innovation, because we are all a work in progress, including myself. Today's article is about the skill of unlearning. Yes, not learning, unlearning. Sometimes the best skill you can have, especially now in the age of AI, isn't just to learn, it's about unlearning. And today we're going to unpack what that means. Look, for most of my career, when I first got into the business, I think for so many of us Gen Xers, when you walked in the building, the people who had the most experience, the older, tended to have all the answers. Today, that is no longer true. That also doesn't mean they don't have the answers. It simply means that both and not or play a huge role, right? So for most of my career, learning was the currency. You had to learn the system, you had to learn the rules, you learned to learn how things have always been. At least that's how it felt when I first got in. But with time, I started to realize as technology and systems became flatter and the challenges of the day, especially with technology, having it became less linear and more circular, right? Um, and so you had to learn and unlearn, try and try again. When I first walked into a newsroom, again, the most senior people were the ones that seemed to have all the answers. And by the way, I totally love them because they are definitely the ones that have context and perspective and lived experience. They bring to the table things that oftentimes rookies do not. But I also believe that rookies bring to the table things that those of us who have been in the business for longer have not, or don't have as well, right? And so tenure at that time equaled credibility. And for a long time, that made sense. Institutions were built on continuity, stability was rewarded, um, and mastery was rewarded. But the but then AI didn't just change the tools, it also changed a little bit the rules of relevance. And it continues to do so today. And it wasn't just AI, it was technology in general and the rate of speed in which we required change. So today, the most dangerous phrase in any organization, and I think honestly, for a long time it's been, is this is just the way we've always done it. I once heard a professor say to me that if you are not, um, a status quo or staying in the same space is actually going backwards already instead of moving forward. Not because experience doesn't matter, like I said, but because experience that cannot be updated can become very brittle. So why unlearning feels so uncomfortable? Like let's call it for what it is. This isn't is something easy for anybody. Um, our brains are wired to. There is a phrase called the path of least resistance, and oftentimes it's used, I don't know, in a negative form, but it's also a way of self-preservation. And our bodies and our minds are coded that way. We're wired because the body wants to preserve as many calories as possible. And so every time we put ourselves in a new situation, we feel completely uncomfortable. And the amount of energy we use to overcome that, um, eats up more of those calories or whatever. And so what while the body, and as I've said this before, is and the mind is coded to keep us alive, it doesn't mean that it's keeping us thriving, right? If we're not evolving if we're not evolving, then we are actually falling backwards. But the mind registers that differently. It thinks, okay, we're in our comfort zone, let's stay there, because that preserves energy and that just keeps us alive and breathing. Well, being alive and breathing doesn't make you successful today. And so recognizing that you're going to have to put yourself out there to try new things, stretch past your comfort zone, and in many cases, have the ability to look internally and realize that some of your old assumptions, beliefs, some of the way things used to be are no longer needed that way. I remember getting into a newsroom, and when I first arrived, you needed to, in order to go live, you needed a live truck, you needed a cameraman, sometimes you needed an audio person. Today we're going live just from our phones. And so if I operated with that reality, that was once true for me in the past, I would not be able to keep up with the times and stay relevant today, right? So, um, you know, getting back on path to the article that I wrote, when someone asks us to unlearn something, the brain often hears you're obsolete, right? It's a moment of tension. That's a moment of energy where we are gonna we're gonna use that energy. Neuroscience also explain why this reaction is so visceral. The brain is an efficiency machine, as I mentioned. Over time, it builds neural shortcuts. It says, you know what? It path of least resistance is it's your shortcuts. It works, right? It's a well-worn pathways that conserve energy. These pathways live largely in the what they call the basal ganglia and are reinforced by dopamine when a familiar approaches. It's like, oh, I know how to do this. I think another way to think about this too, where you can catch yourself if you tend to err, because we all do, okay? But it's about being aware of it. How many times have you made a to-do list and you focus on the stuff that is the easiest to do, but many times it's not the most important and it's not the most urgent. Why? Because it feels good to check the box. But over time, you realize that if you're not focusing on what's important, then, and you're just focusing on what's urgent and easy, you're not actually making progress. And so unlearning requires interrupting some of those pathways. That interruption costs more cognitive energy, activates uncertainty, engages the amygdala for threat detection system, right? Like, oh my God, I'm not okay, right? The mind always wants to feel that we're okay. But its version and definition of okay is, like I've mentioned before, just being alive and breathing, not always thriving. And so it's up to us to be aware of that, to sort of those checks and balances, right? To be like, no, this makes me comfortable and it keeps me safe, but does it keep me thriving, right? So unlearning feels like danger even when it's growth. The plastic brain. Why change is possible at any age. Here's the good news. Neuroplasticity doesn't disappear with age, it becomes selective. The adult brain is fully capable of change, but it requires attention, repetition, and emotional relevance. This is where people who are younger, this is why it's such a great opportunity to do early intervention, especially about leadership and growth mindset and the frameworks I talk about here, is because when you don't have the bad habit, you don't have to expend the time unlearning to then relearn. You're just learning, right? And learning the right way. Clearly though, we have to continue with time. We have to adopt a mindset that what was relevant and true in the past may not be relevant and true in the future, especially when it comes to business success, technology, all of those things that are part of our everyday life in corporate America. When we consciously challenge our outdated assumptions, okay, we weaken the old neural pathways and create space for new ones. This process, sometimes called synaptic pruning, right, is how the brain makes room for more adaptive thinking. But you need to be intentional about it and be self aware. AI accelerates this need because feedback loops are faster. The rate of change, when you look over the course of progress in history and technology, what took us years to go and build the television set took centuries, let's say, right? Before it came about. We have that window becomes shorter and shorter and shorter of new technology and progress that we keep making. So those loops that we have to go back and reflect and say, what do I know or assume and how do I unlearn it, are becoming faster and faster, which is why even you see like in technology companies, you use agile, a God, I forgot the word, but whatever, agile and different models of design, because you have to, it isn't about putting it out there and there it's one and done. It's about coming back to it. And we oftentimes, that means that we have to put ourselves in this cycle of learning and unlearning, right? That has become the new norm. Even if when you've gotten to the business, when you were younger, it was more, linear, right? Now it's more cyclical. Um, AI also accelerates that old expertise expires more quickly. Static roles are being replaced by more fluid problem solving. What used to in the past be that you needed all these specialists in something, is now with time, the role of generalist seems to be more and more, somebody more like an orchestrator is what we're going to be seeing in this world of AI is needed from a management perspective more than just that deep expertise only. In other words, the environment is forcing the brain to adapt whether we like it or not, right? So learning versus unlearning in the AI era. When traditional learning asks, what new skill do I need? Unlearning asks, okay, what belief, habit, or identity is no longer serving me? And that can be both personal, professional, technical. That's a much harder question to answer, right? Especially when you know that physiologically, right? Like your body is going to fight that to us, initially is going to fight that because you're putting yourself in a situation where you'll have to feel uncomfortable, feel threatened, and expend, and expend more energy. AI doesn't reward those who know the most. It rewards those who can ask better questions, reframe problems, let go of ego driven certainty, rebuild faster than others who are clinging to mastery. The leaders struggling most right now aren't the least capable. There's actually what they more attached, right? Um, Someone once said to me recently that the people who will master AI the best is those who understand the Socratic method more, which is asking better questions. While institutional knowledge still matters, it's different now, right? Unlearning doesn't mean dismissing experience. By no means. There are certain things that AI will never touch, but we do need to be capable of compartmentalizing and saying this is in the bucket of what is true and it was true and is still true, and this is what's in the bucket of what is no longer true, and I need to rethink that. And it needs to be absence of ego, right? We will have a tendency to say, no, no, this is where I have to stay, right? Because the brain is telling you to stay within your comfort zone. Institutional knowledge will provide context, pattern recognition, ethical grounding, historical memory. Those are all things that AI doesn't replace. Okay. Um, but experience must evolve from I have the answers to I know how to ask the right questions. The future belongs to those who compare wisdom with curiosity. And in one of my favorite books is called Rookie Smart, and by a woman named Sam Wiseman. And she does an entire study about when it is that rookies are better suited for a task and when veterans are. And it goes on, and I won't do a whole thing. I don't want to go into that sidebar, but what she what she discovered was that rookies are better at innovation and at turnaround time, mostly because, not, she doesn't say this, this is myself interjecting here, mostly because they have less to unlearn, right? That little like cage of this is the way it's done is less, pronounced in them, right? That's one. They also, by the way, are at the forefront of technology and, and innovation because they try new things. And we all should hope to be like that. Veterans, on the other hand, are better at, what is the right problem to solve, and also having the human capital or these things like I mentioned, like that ethical grounding, that historical memory, context, patterns to solve the right problem, right? So both are just as necessary. I had a news director who once told me that you always needed to have bookends, somebody who was that like rookie and that more veteran, the more veteran, right? Together they are not at odds, which is why I do challenge, right, the generational friction that there is sometimes within corporations is it's not an either or, it's actually an and where you're best suited to take advantage, and be successful. So here's a simple unlearning framework for you to think about. When something feels outdated or inefficient, first of all, it's honesty. Even if it makes you feel uncomfortable, you have to say, what assumption am I operating under? When was the last time that I proved this to be true? What would I try if I wasn't protecting my identity? What would a beginner notice that I'm ignoring? And this isn't about erasing the past, it's about losing your grip on it. Okay, the quiet advantage. Those that who master unlearning develop a quiet edge. They're less defensive. They're more adaptable. They're faster to integrate new tools. They're better collaborators across generations. They don't panic when systems shift because their confidence isn't tied to being right. It's tied to being responsive and relevant, right? I always say that be more afraid. While most people are afraid of change, I say be more afraid of becoming irrelevant than of change. And when you are like that, you will find that you will enter into these spaces where you do feel uncomfortable saying, what's worse, the change or becoming irrelevant? And I always chose the change. Like I tend to or try to choose the change, right? It makes you be less rigid. The future doesn't belong to those who know the most. Okay. If there's anything I've learned over time is the more I've learned, the more I realize I don't know anything. Um, the future, it belongs to those who can relate, rewire, reimagine again and again and again, right? And unlearning isn't a loss, it's actually leadership. So that's it for today. And if you liked what you heard, Brad, I encourage you to please share it with anybody you know. And till next time, take care.